The whole thing. And questioning the dominant paradigm within the dominant paradigm is a fool's errand.
Do you ever listen or read any of the things that Noam Chomsky writes?
Oh, yes.
I mean, there's a good example of, even if you don't agree with even most of what he says, and I happen to agree with most of what he says, we don't have that. That's not part of the legitimate discourse in our society.
That's right.
You never hear religion questioned. You never hear capitalism questioned. You never hear our foreign policy questioned. It's great to be a member of the empire, though.
Yes.
If only we could afford to use all that oil we're beating up the people of the world over.
Right. All I want to do is have a conversation with somebody I have great respect for and have had great respect for a long time. I view you as mentor, so I want to have a conversation because you're
making me feel old, and I admire what you've been doing. I love your talks. So,
well, thank you. You went down a path a long time ago and met great resistance, and I find myself going down a similar path. So one of the things I want to talk about is that how might I frame the conversation so that it doesn't immediately draw a barrage of hate mail?
I don't know. I certainly had the hate mail, the threats, the whole business over time. But I did have a huge advantage over you in that I always had complete support from my colleagues. For instance, you probably know of Ernst Mayr, though you were an ecologist rather than an evolutionist.
Oh, yeah.
And I had minor differences with Ernst in evolutionary theory, and I used to get him to Stanford about every 3 years so that we could have a debate once each graduate student generation to discuss these things. And it was always a friendly debate. And when I wrote The Population Bomb, he sent me a handwritten letter saying, "That's wonderful. Keep at it. You're absolutely right." And he virtually every year would send me a holographic letter saying, "Keep at the bastards," and so on. I had total support from Dick Holm, who was senior to me in the department, and we ended up writing stuff together. And virtually all of my colleagues, I mean, if you look around now, who are the people you admire in the world? Mike Mann, John Holdren. I mean, John and I have written 50 things together. He's, of course, strangled now. But, so I've had the advantage, and in a sense, you have the advantage of a lot of people out there who admire you. My good luck was to be right in a department where everybody got along well. We've had, one of the reasons I stayed at Stanford is we've had no big disputes at Stanford. We've even, in the biology department, we've even basically gotten the molecular and the cellular and the population people together and supporting each other. And so I don't have the problem that Gromlich produced for you. And so that's been a huge advantage. How to avoid the nuts? Impossible. If you say anything that's correct in this world, you're going to bring a load of crap down on your head, no question. You should hear some of the stuff that comes into my answering machine.
Fortunately, I can only imagine, and also fortunately, because I'm not at a university anymore, my telephone number is not common knowledge.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. But it's I say that there are a lot of people who will threaten you. There are relatively few who will do anything about it. They're mostly idiots and cowards. And
of course. Of course, when I receive a death threat or when somebody threatens to call the authorities, whatever that means, I send them my address. And so far, nobody has shown up in a black helicopter or other.
Yeah, well, they're all still in the sewers of Chicago, as you must know. But I mean, I think one of the places that, if I recall the things that I've listened to of yours that we agree on, is that even most of our colleagues are too soft in their presentation of the situation. I mean, let's suppose there's only a 10% chance that you and I are right to be so concerned about the fate of civilization. But what kind of insurance would you take out against that? You know the numbers. You chance of your house burning down is something like 1 in 200, and you pay all kinds of money for that. Chance of your grandchildren not having a life, and you're not willing to do anything about that. And the reasons are perfectly clear. When I discuss these problems with colleagues in general who are knowledgeable, everybody has, from the U.S. point of view, the same answer for what's the first thing you have to do, and that's get the money out of politics. And since that's impossible, it doesn't make me terribly optimistic.
Well, sure. And I mean, the system has been captured by those with money. And we're so far down that track that it seems to me people proposing that idea after decades of there being no progress in that direction are living in what I call the world of should. Yeah. You know, there's all kinds of things that should happen in a perfect world, but that's not our world.
Well, of course, we have the other failure in that the universities, the whole education system is broken. If the universities and the other schools taught what's actually going on in the world, then even the Kochs might realize that their own butts and their children's butts are on the line just as much as the rest of the world. But one of my ancient students, I had two first students. You may know either of them, Michael Soule, rewilding, and Harry Recker, who's in Australia. And Harry said in correspondence sometime in the last year, talking about how broken Australia's school system is, he said, any country whose major cultural things are mall crawling and sports is never going to have a decent school system. And I think that's true. Stanford University's structure was invented by a colleague of mine that you probably never met. His name was Aristotle. And it was birthed by him a long time ago and then bar mitzvahed by the Royal Society in about 1690. And we still have it. I mean, the university has this preposterous structure with a whole series of departments, and no serious human problem could be solved within any one of them. And yet, we go on acting as if it's just as important to support the Department of Romance Languages as it is to do something about climate change and organize ourselves to do it.
Well, right. And not only that, but all universities are so deeply embedded within the culture that is dominated by money and seemingly unable to escape that trap, that gives me even more cause for pessimism.
Well, look at what's happening here at Stanford and at Harvard, where Stanford is as usual ahead of Harvard, but look on the divestment issue. I don't know if you followed it at all, but the argument is made that if Harvard divests from fossil fuels, that it will simply be symbolic. Well, if you know how the world works, 80% of it's symbolic. In other words, the important thing is emotion and symbolism. We've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that telling people the scientific facts about climate disruption will not change their behavior.
That's right.
And so you're left with symbolism. That's A. And B, of course, should the world ever wake up and realize that the reserves of fossil fuels are going to have to stay in the ground, that means the fossil fuel stocks will all tank. Right. And I think Stanford, that got out of coal but is still in other fossil fuels, must think that their financial advisors are so smart that they'll realize the day before everything tanks and sell out in time. In other words, the fossil fuel investments are at least medium term deeply stupid financially as well.
Let's backtrack a ways to the population bomb. And people frequently incorrectly quote what you wrote as predictions instead of scenarios, and talk about things like the overpopulation myth. And you've been tolerating that for 47 years. How did you How did you come to even write that? And what kind of support was there for you at the time?
The thing they most criticize is saying the battle to feed all of humanity is over. And I keep getting that day in and day out. And they seem not to know that 800 million people are starving now, that there's an additional 2 billion who can't lead decent lives because they're micronutrient malnourished. And we've had the same answer, Ann and I, who Ann was really the co-author of the book, ever since it was published. If it's going to be so easy, for example, to feed 9.5 billion people in the middle of this century, why don't we feed them now and show that we can do it? In other words, all these things are always, don't worry about it, we'll take care of everybody, but we've never taken care of everybody. Now, the reason I'm thumbing through this is to see if I can find the acknowledgments. Here are the following people who read and criticized on the manuscript. Professor Richard Holm, you probably don't know about Dick, but we published a lot together. Peter Raven, you've probably heard of. He was the Home Secretary of the National Academy for something like 16 years.
Yeah, I know both of those names.
John Thomas, who was a botanist here, died not long ago. Donald Kennedy, who was at the time the chair of my department and then became the president of the university. Jonathan Friedman of Stanford's Department of Psychology, whole bunch of graduate students, and I acknowledged the whole long list of people at Stanford. So basically, the department chair, the future president of the university, and some of the most important professors all read and approved of the population bomb. The people who didn't approve of it, well, what can I tell you?
Well, that's very, very impressive to have that kind of support from a university.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I say I've been very lucky to have been at I mean, look, none of our institutions are perfect, far from it, but some of them are a lot better than others. It's like when you look at the history of American imperialism. If it had been the Russians or Chinese doing it, they probably would have been nastier. But that doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, say that we're therefore okay. I mean, there are things Carter did in Nicaragua, Oscar Arias, who I know knew personally, who I really admire, just like I admire Carter in many ways, ended up doing terrible things. I like Obama in many ways, but I think he's doing some terrible things. But of course, he's trapped like John Holden is trapped. We're in a system that's unbelievable.
Yes, absolutely. The system has really captured us all. We're all born into captivity. We have this lifestyle that we're born into, and we didn't exert any control over that. It was just here when we showed up.
Well, and I at least plead that I think we'd be in a lot better shape if we had started controlling the human population a long time ago, because I'm absolutely convinced if you want the maximum number of human beings to live and to live happy lives, you've got to have population of one, maybe 1.5 billion people in perpetuity, not see how many you can cram in till the whole thing falls apart. And the U.S. still had a population of 100 million people, which was roughly what it was when I was born, instead of 300 plus, there'd be 1/3 as much greenhouse gas, actually less than that even.
Right.
Because there's non-linearities in the system. You put in more and more as you get less and less efficient and more crowded and so on. So,
absolutely. And
if you're looking for cheer from me, you're probably mining the wrong ore. I got to say one thing, that Pauline can really keep that smile on. She must be pretty depressed, but
I was at an event a couple of months ago, and the hostess turned to me and said, in front of a bunch of young people in their 20s and early 30s, turned to me and said, "I brought Guy here to give you a message of hope." And my mouth just dropped open. If I'm your hope guy, you came to the wrong place.
It's really weird. I get this all the time. Can't you say something cheerful? And actually, one of the sad things is that you get these little cheerful things like things that I approve of, like the Grameen Bank, okay, or World Bank and so on. The World Bank has brought about 25,000 people out of poverty, dressed them in pinstripe suits and flown them around the world for years. But they're doing nothing at all of any real use. Same thing, the Grameen Bank is a wonderful idea, but it's not changing the basic situation. And you get all these things. Wind power is a really good idea, but as long as we keep increasing the flux of greenhouse gases, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Right.
I was once told by an Indian bureaucrat that I should cheer up that this was last year, like maybe 1971. He said, last year we shipped 100 million condoms into the field. And I said, well, if they weren't used for flashlight covers, maybe that covered the first couple of nights of January. But what's happening to the total fertility rate is what I want to know. So it's this business of effort or little success stories. And then they'll say, well, if you can only expand the little success story. Well, the whole system prevents that.
Absolutely.
How can you have a capitalist system that doesn't grow? Is that possible? In other words, even the banking system, partial fractional reserve banking, implies continuous growth.
Absolutely.
And I've been trying to persuade my colleagues in economics at the Bayer Institute maybe to hold discussion on what would an economy look like that wasn't growing in the traditional sense. That's what economists should be studying, but they're studying more important stuff like the economics of Major League Baseball and stuff that's really critical to the future of the world.
Yes,
Or
exactly.
the inflation of footballs. World's gone down the drain. We've had a week of ball inflation being the top news story, followed by a week of was it the right call for the play?
Right. Yes. Yeah. One might conclude that our priorities have gone a little askew.
Just a little, yeah.
Just a little. Well, Herman Daly is involved with the Center for the Advancement of a Steady State Economy. And I guess they've been around for about 8 years. And as nearly as I can tell, have gained no traction whatsoever because I suspect you're right.
You know Growth Busters?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, same thing. I mean, Herman's an old friend of ours.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we once, maybe 40 years ago, his wife is Brazilian. And we were in Brazil, and they invited us. We were staying in a hotel that I remember very clearly because it reared up, and right behind it was a steep slope with a favela on it. So you could be living in first world comfort and look across at people living in cardboard boxes. And Herman and Marcia invited us to dinner in a restaurant across town. And he said, leave your wallet and everything at home. We'll cover it. But don't bring anything with you that you can't afford to have stolen. And so we put it all in the safety deposit box at the bank. Got to the restaurant. There were 2 guys with shotguns outside, and we had a wonderful dinner. I don't know why I'm telling you this. And went back to the hotel and found the lobby in a shambles because a gang had attacked the hotel to try and get to the safe deposit boxes. And there had been a shootout in the hotel lobby. That's what the world is coming to more and more because there are too damn many people who just are not given a chance. They have been utterly, the level of marginalization gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the global capitalist system works on them.
Of course. This whole neoclassical economics idea that the rising tide floats all boats is absurd and has been demonstrated to be absurd for a long time.
Nothing trickles down but shit. That's the basic.
Right. Early on, when I first heard about Ronald Reagan's trickle-down economics, I heard the perfect description of it. It really means piss on you economics.
Yeah, right.
That's trickling, all right.
Yeah. It's depressing. And the issue is, what the hell do we do about it? What I've been failing at as usual, but with the help of Joan Diamond, who's absolutely terrific. Joan is the wife of Kirk Smith, who is the guy who showed the worst air pollution problems in the world are in third world huts. And when he was at the East-West Center, he's an Academy member, everything. When he was at the East-West Center, Joan rose to be the only non-sumo wrestler executive vice president of Hawaiian Electric, famous for being able to fire people and make them love it, which is no small task.
Mm-hmm.
And when John Holdren took over the Woods Hole Research Center, he took Joan there to run it for him. And then when he went to the White House, Joan came back to California, continuing her work with the Nautilus Foundation, which is trying another one of these hopeless tasks to get a non-nuclear Northeast Asia. She's had a lot of experience negotiating with North Koreans. And she said the problems you and I are interested in are so much more important. She wanted to take over and help me with the mob, which is I don't know if you ever run into the mob at all, but the website is mahb.stanford.edu, and we're trying to get civil society to organize themselves so they at least attack the major drivers all the time, whatever their own, if you're interested in giving better housing to poor people, which I am, you've got to realize if you let the temperature rise 10 degrees Celsius, there's not going to be housing for anybody. And so we've all got this set of general problems, and we've been failing magnificently, but Joan has been working very hard on it. I don't know why I started telling you that, but that's the only solution that I can see is we've got to have a bottom-up movement that somehow is designed to interface with good people at the top and tie them together, and that's so unlikely. I mean,
right?
Do you know Jim Brown?
Oh yeah,
the biogeographer. Oh yeah. Well, Jim, you've heard about the argument Jim and I have had, but I'm beginning to think he was correct.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. For those who aren't familiar with it, Ann and I said at some point that we thought there was maybe a 10% chance of civilization persisting. And Jim just said, you're out of your minds. There's at most a 1% chance. Right. And since then, as I've watched things evolve, I'm beginning to think Jim, I always knew he was smarter than I was, but I think his prognostication is more accurate too. What's your guess?
Well, it's pretty interesting. I don't know if you know Tim Garrett, the atmospheric scientist at the University of Utah. He has published 3 papers now. The first one was in the journal Climatic Change. And he points out that civilization is a heat engine, that unless we terminate civilization, we're going to trigger runaway greenhouse. And Paul Beckwith, who's a climate scientist at Ottawa University, concludes that we already have. He studies Arctic methane, and he says we're headed for a 5 or 6 C temperature rise within a decade or two. Given that we haven't had humans on the planet at 3.3 C above baseline, that sounds a little problematic to me, especially given the rapidity of the change. So I can't imagine civilization will survive beyond 2 C or so, because that eliminates the ability to grow grains in the places they're grown. So
not only that, look at how much of the world we can only occupy because we air condition now, something people haven't looked at. I remember driving around China a year or so ago, and they're building these huge high-rise apartments for the people moving in from the countryside. And I mean, have you been to China recently?
I haven't been to China ever.
Oh, I tried driving into Chengdu. You see these things going up. I don't mean 2 or 3. I mean 20 or 30 or 40 of them. Low ceilings, all designed for air conditioning. You roll down the window of your car and you choke from the coal fumes from burning the coal to pump the buildings down. It's anyway. Yeah. But by the way, do you have a copy of the population bomb?
I have an old paperback copy.
Oh, that's it. Okay, but the interesting thing is, in there I cited Fremlin's work. Do you know that? He actually calculated how much civilization could grow under various circumstances until the second law did you in. Right. So no, it's an old idea.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. And speaking of old ideas, people like Michael Mann and James Hansen have been talking about climate change since the 1970s. Are you in touch with them? Do you know if their message...
I actually was going to have dinner with Ben Sander and Mike this week at the time of the AAAS, but our plans fell through. But yeah, I'm in touch with them. And of course, one of my closest friends was Steve Schneider, who was probably the leader at putting this stuff up. And Stephen, Terry, and Ann and I and Tom Lovejoy have traveled around the world together birding, because we think, you might as, if we follow the the motto of the Titanic Club. Are you a member? Would you and Pauline like to be inducted?
Absolutely. Whatever.
Yeah, all you have to do is memorize our motto. If you booked passage on the Titanic, there's no point in going steerage.
Yes. Yes, I love that.
Now you're now both members.
Assuming I can remember that tomorrow.
Well, if you drink enough tonight, you'll remember. When we wrote the population bomb, we were worried about climate change. We didn't know what was crystal clear for a very long time. If you add crap to the atmosphere, you're going to change the climate. No, we didn't know at that time the most of the forcing hadn't been the heat forcing hadn't been discovered. It was a whole bunch of guys who showed that it wasn't only about half of it was CO2.
Right.
But this is all have you ever heard on national news that the more people you have, the more greenhouse gases are going to be in the atmosphere? Much more.
I heard that on MSNBC about 3 weeks ago, in fact.
Oh, really?
Yeah, from you.
Oh.
It's a small club.
I actually, Gavin Schmidt mentioned it on the NPR the day they announced it was a sort of sideways mention, but the day they announced that 2014 was the hottest year.
Mm-hmm.
But again, look at what's happening with right before your face. The climate is changing, and they almost never make the connection.
No. Well, and I think that Americans in particular, most of whom are not in steerage, are easily convinced that it's not so bad because changing our lifestyles is anathema to most individuals. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, hell, it's anathema to me.
Right. So,
at what level? I mean, obviously, if we had decent mass transit, I'm very lucky. One of the reasons I've stayed at Stanford is I can walk to work, and that is a fantastic advantage. Because I once had to commute by car, but most people end up commuting by car, which is a truly miserable way to live.
Of course.
But they don't see that these things could be made better. But you can't make them better on your own, sort of. In other words, there's got to be political action and so on. You can't personally build a mass transit system that will give you real convenience in an area like Palo Alto now in the Bay Area.
Right, absolutely. I did my first sabbatical leave at Berkeley, and I was able to walk to campus from there. I mean, the Bay Area is, I think, the single most European city in the United States.
Yeah,
because
probably.
It does have mass transit, and it has communities that in which you're able to actually conduct all your commerce on foot.
You got to be in the right place. And of course, when were you up here?
That was 95, 96. And
it's gotten a lot worse since then.
I'm sure. I look at every aspect of our society since 95, 96, and it's gotten a lot worse.
Yeah. Well, and then you get into the things that are not covered in climate that are absolutely critical. There's a new book out that'll be available in the U.S. In March on Amazon by Julian Cribb called Poisoned Planet. If you haven't seen it or read it, it'll just make you sick, but it'll show you that the toxification problem may be on the same scale as the climate change problem. Mike Clare's book, The Race After What's Left.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's a good place if you're giving lectures because it's got the information on, where China and Saudi Arabia are buying land in poor countries to feed their populations because they realize they're not going to be able to feed them themselves for much more longer.
Right. There are many, many, many problems we face, and I would argue that essentially all of them are rooted in industrial civilization.
That's right. Great.
That's
growth of our share of the system.
Right.
And how you turn that around, if you come up with a magic, actually, the neocons in the U.S. may have come up with a magic bullet for curing that because, they kept pushing NATO into Putin's face. Putin's a thug, agreed, but not as bad a thug as people like Dick Cheney and so on. And now we're getting some pushback, and the chances of it escalating into something that will cure the problem of human civilization are not trivial. Just like you may have seen the paper about 6 or 7 years ago now showing that a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, just a small one, would end our civilization. So, and of course, there's always the huge mathematical literature pioneered by people like Bob May showing the bigger the population, the greater the chances of a horrendous plague taking it all the way down or way down. We had the beautiful, having screamed about this for many decades along with my colleagues, we had a wonderful demonstration with Ebola of how prepared we are. Different policy in every state, different national policy, inadequate isolation facilities, no thought to really designing great safety uniforms for. We had a seminar at Berkeley from a guy who was in the South Somalia outbreak about 1974 or something, and he said that you can't imagine how tough it is and how impossible it is to wear protective clothing in 105-degree heat where there's no air conditioning.
Yeah.
Basically, all our technological skills have not been put to creating really decent, garb for great epidemics.
Right, right. These are all amazing topics. I have this relatively large and growing core of volunteers who, like Pauline, who's shooting the video, like Ivy and Dean, other videographers, and people who were in the business world for a long time. Peter Melton, who organized this conversation and has organized several of my speaking tours on the West Coast. A guy in New Zealand named Kevin Hester, all these people. Anyway, their current big push is to put together a program for Paris later this year for the COP21 meetings that discuss important topics: population, foreign policy, methane, psychological issues, spiritual aspects, journalism, the whole template and how it's connected to climate change. Want to join us?
In Paris?
Yeah.
But I would certainly be willing and happy to do, I think, the second half of December, except right around Christmas, I'm not super busy. And surely some of it will be done by Skype and remote.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that's certainly a possibility.
Yeah. At this point, we're just trying to steer the conversation in Paris to cover all these aspects that are interrelated with climate change.
Yeah. Oh, that's an excellent thing to do, to say the least. You will send me an email, and I will send you details.
Yes. Absolutely. Let's make that happen.
If you'd like, I might try and get Mike and Ben Santer. All right, we can see how much they think we're nuts. Anyway,
and I'll try to get Peter Melton, who's my local contact there, engaged in the conversation.
What does Peter do besides good things?
Peter was a sports broadcaster, a communications guy. He has done all kinds of interesting jobs, events coordination. And just about a year and a half ago, he moved back into the house he grew up in to take care of his father in his final months. And so he's about my age, a little younger than me. And he is taking my message to heart even before it became my message, which is giving up the pursuit of material possessions in exchange for spending time with the people he loves, including his parents, who are and his dad is on the decline. So he's been doing great stuff and has had myriad careers throughout his life. But all in all, what he's been doing lately is organizing events on my behalf and serving as my volunteer events coordinator and program manager.
That's great.
It is.
Wonderful.
it's amazing, really, that these people barely know me and they go out of their way to provide all this assistance to get these messages out. Two questions or two issues I want to sort of hit on before we close this conversation. I very much appreciate your time. What do you think about our current climate situation, and what advice would you have for me to get the message out about climate change?
I wish I had an answer to that, because I mean, basically, as I say to people, I'm primarily a propagandist now. I don't, I enjoy doing research, and I still do it. And the big problem that I face is that climate change is one major part of a series of things that we call the perfect storm. My own technical expertise is much more on the biodiversity side. On the other hand, climate and biodiversity are tied together so tightly that you can hardly. The butterflies that we worked on for 40 years on Jasper Ridge on Stanford campus largely went extinct because of climate change. I mean, it's a no-brainer. So all of these things, when I set up the Center for Conservation Biology here, the idea was to look at every aspect of human activity and how it affects the future of civilization. And so, for instance, I wrote a book in 2000 called Human Natures. If you don't have a copy of that, I'll give you one when you come. But do you have a copy of The Dominant Animal?
No, I don't.
You're going to send me your snail mail address, and I'll mail you some stuff.
That'd be great.
And I'll also send you some papers, and you'll have more shit than you can possibly deal with.
Well, that's the thing. I usually wait to try to read people's writing until after they're dead, so I have some chance of keeping up with them.
What do you can start in 20.
See, you're so prolific.
No.
Way I can write faster than I can read.
I'm going to live till I'm 106. Don't worry about it. That's when I'm going to be shot by a jealous husband. So we deal with everything, and that's the mob. Its origin. It's worth telling you this story. When the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment came out around 2000, you remember that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Ann and I wrote somewhere that nobody who knew anything was surprised by the fact that our ecosystems, many of them are going down the drain. Said what we really need is a Millennium Assessment of human behavior, because the fact that this is happening is not causing any significant change in human behavior. And so that's how we founded the mob. And Don Kennedy was then editor of Science, got really interested in it, and Don and I wrote about it, and so on. We actually did some sort of practice stuff here at Stanford. The original idea was to try and bring more people from the social sciences and humanities in, because again, it's crystal clear to all of us that science alone won't give you the answer. You got the symbolism. You think about the humanities, that one single picture of Earth from the moon changed the world more than most of the science that we've done, and so on. But it turned out that the social scientists mostly just wanted to do more of their own research, no matter how ridiculous or trivial it was. And it didn't really work out well. But we got some people who were really interested. Gene Rosa, who unhappily died almost immediately after he got heavily involved with us from lung cancer. He had been doing work on IPAT from the sociological point of view with a series of colleagues with York, and I'm having a senior moment on actually the biggest name. Anyway, but he explained to us, among other things, that the social scientists would not participate in any organization that had behavior in its title, which struck me as nuts, but it probably traces back to Skinner and things like that.
Right.
And so we ended up, with his help, changing the mob's title from the Millennium Assessment of Human Behavior to a ridiculous title, the Millennium Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere, just so we could keep the mob name, because we liked mobsters and it already had started up. But I thought it was particularly depressing that a whole bunch of people wouldn't help to save the world because they don't like the name and the title of an organization trying to do it. And it tells you why We're fighting an uphill battle, to say the very least.
Right. That's all we need to know right there.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
People are unwilling to take on a project because they don't like the name or they don't like the color of the paint on the building.
Yeah. I mean, all these organizations that want to save the world mostly are competing for funds that barely exist. So,
Right.
you wanted some other second thing you wanted to ask me. My biggest problem with aging is my voice tends to disappear. You may have noticed me drinking gin throughout this entire interview.
Well, the second issue is how best to get the message out. Do you have any media organizations that you would suggest? I mean, what's the way?
I used to be able to get, I did the Tonight Show something like 20 or 25 times.
Mm-hmm.
Carson was really interested in these issues. He was the most powerful person in Hollywood. So even though virtually everybody else in the whole organization hated the idea, he kept having me on. And he had Steve Schneider on. He had other people on serious topics. But since then, totally dried up. John Holdren made it to the Letterman show for 15 minutes, and I think that's the only, or 10 minutes, and that's the only thing remotely like it that I've seen. One of the reasons have you written a book?
I've written a dozen books. Yeah.
Well, have your publishers, they sometimes will hire a publicist and get you on the radio. That's one of the ways to go. But It's hard to see the effect of that. It's mostly stations and small stations where you're preaching to the converted.
Right. And so I've been on lots and lots of radio shows, and I was interviewed by Tom Hartman and Abby Martin, both of whom are with RT, Press TV, sort of nibbling around at the mainstream. But MSNBC and CNN are not calling. Fox News, I'm sure I'm right around the corner for them.
Oh, yeah, right. No, I have exactly the same problem. Even guys, well, again, who listens to Bill Maher? He's pretty much on track on a lot of these issues.
Right,
but,
yes.
But if that's the thing, I've been struggling to find ways to make news for 50 years now and failing at a fairly steady rate. If I had, we just keep doing as much as we can. We tried training scientists to interact better with the media, and some of them have been working at it pretty well. But the thing is, the control in the media is from the top, and it's a really nasty business. And
that's right. I would argue that we have a corporate media and a corporate government because corporations are so deeply embedded in monetarily in control.
I do as much of this stuff as I can. I would love to do Rachel Maddow or get on the Letterman show or something like that, but it just or Bill Maher. But each publisher will hire a publicist, but I don't have money to hire a publicist. Is what it goes down to. I'm supporting the mob out of my pocket primarily on prize money that I would when I give lectures or get a prize, I tend to put it into a fund at Stanford, which is 401c3. So it's a tax deduction. I don't have to pay it directly.
Right.
And then I use that to support primarily now to support the mob.
Right.
But there's no money. I can't get any grant money. I shouldn't say can't get any. I've gotten small amounts from small foundations occasionally.
No, this has been great. I really appreciate the conversation. I'll be in touch regarding the early to mid-March visit.
Yes, please, as fast as possible, because my time fills, and I'd be delighted to get together. I've really loved your stuff, and
Thank you.
A great pleasure for me.
Thank
How
you.
lucky I am to be alive. I see redwood trees and mountains, flowing rivers to the sea. I see the same beauty in the eyes of you and me. Can't believe how wonderful the world is, how grateful